Hi, thank you. So this is my master's thesis research for the University of Rhode Island that I just recently completed. And it's focused on offshore wind and community benefits in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina.
Sorry, Grant, Grant, could you maybe share your camera?
Oh, yeah.
If you have one? Yeah, okay, yes. Thank you.
All right, hello. So I'll start off with a brief overview of U.S. offshore wind development, provide some background on community benefits, and then I'll discuss my research questions, provide some background on the study area and the sampling methods, discuss my data collection analysis, and then go into greater depth about my overarching themes and policy recommendations and future research. So in the United States, offshore wind represents more than 2,000 gigawatts of energy resource potential. And in recent years, there's been a growing interest in offshore wind development from coastal states along the US East Coast. Currently, governors have committed to a total of 25.4 gigawatts of offshore wind development along the East Coast. And a partial attribute to that is actually renewable portfolio standards for states, where they pass legislation to mandate that a certain percentage of their energy comes from renewable energy. And then by 2030, the American Wind Energy Association is forecasting that up to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity will be operational. So it's evident that the US offshore wind industry is growing quickly in recent years. But as of right now, as was discussed earlier, the only operational offshore wind farm in the United States is the Block Island wind farm. So in the United States, the federal leasing process, the agency responsible for leasing of energy developments in federal waters is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, also known as BOEM. And they were authorized to do this by the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And their role is to lease energy developments in federal waters from 3 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles. States have authority between the 0 to 3 nautical mile point, with the exception of Texas and the Gulf Coast of Florida that have a 9 nautical mile state waters. And in this leasing process, there are several opportunities for public participation. You see public comment, and public meetings are included in the planning and analysis phase, the leasing phase, and the construction and operations phase. BOEM must also comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA, that mandates that federal agencies must, quote, make diligent efforts to involve the public in preparing and implementing their NEPA procedures. And at the end of this presentation, when I talk about my policy recommendations, we will return to this leasing phase to talk about the incorporation of community benefits. So while there's been a growing interest in wind energy development onshore and offshore at a national and international level, local communities may be opposed to nearby projects. And one way that developers have begun to address local opposition is the provision of community benefits. And a community benefit has been defined as an additional positive provision for the area and people affected by a major development. And developers may offer benefits for a variety of reasons. They can be a form of community engagement. They can also be as a result of statutory conditions imposed by authorities, or they can be from a demand from local communities for benefits. And in the United States, it's not unique to wind energy for community benefits. So what comes to mind is the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is a national fund that is funded through oil leasing revenue from the Outer Continental Shelf. And then an example of a state fund would be the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is also funded through oil revenue. And residents in Alaska actually get a annual dividend of a certain amount of money based on royalties. And I believe in 2018, it was around $1,200 or $1,000, somewhere like that. So, but in the offshore wind industry, community benefits are mostly offered voluntarily by developers. In the United States, obviously, there's not a lot of offshore wind development as of right now. So we look to Europe for examples of community benefits in offshore wind. You do see exceptions to this non-obligatory requirement for community benefits. So for example, Denmark and Germany do have policies in place that require wind farms to have at least partial ownership by local people. And in the United Kingdom, community benefits are not required, but they have become what I kind of view as like a best practice method for developers. And you do see that governments have developed protocols to guide benefit discussions. And there has also been the establishment of a registry that shows the range of community benefits across the country. So what are the most common benefit models? Community ownership scheme, direct investment, and community funds. So community ownership allows individuals to benefit financially through purchasing of shares or bonds in the wind farm. Direct investment, this is like a investment in local facility improvements, environmental improvements, tourism or recreation, telecommunication improvements. They also may fund education programs and apprenticeships for careers in wind energy. And lastly, we have a community fund. This is a benefit where the developer provides monetary payments into a fund that is managed by a local organization for the use of the community. And these payments can be determined by megawatt capacity of the project or through an amount per year related to the revenue of the project, also known as a wind resource tax. So when we look at the United States, offshore developers in the United States are not required to provide benefits. However, developers have provided projects in 2 offshore wind farms so far. So we have the Block Island Wind Farm, which is the only operational offshore wind farm. And then we have the Vineyard Wind Project, which would be the country's first utility scale offshore wind farm. Right now it's in the planning phase. So for the Block Island Wind Farm, the developer, Deepwater Wind, signed a community benefit agreement with the town of New Shoreham on Block Island. And in this agreement, the developer agreed to pay for infrastructure improvements where the transmission cable made landfall. And the town also negotiated a fiber optic cable to be included in the electricity cable bundle coming from the mainland Rhode Island to the island. And Vineyard Wind Project, which is an 800 megawatt proposed utility scale project off of Martha's Vineyard, they signed a community benefit agreement with a power cooperative on Martha's Vineyard called Vineyard Power. And in this agreement, Vineyard Power, the energy cooperative, agrees to advocate and support offshore wind legislation in Massachusetts. They also agree to support the Vineyard Wind Project through education and outreach. And they also provide advice and guidance to Vineyard Wind throughout the permitting and financing process. And then Vineyard Wind, the developer, agrees to investigate local job creation on Martha's Vineyard and then possible benefits associated with the transmission cable. They also are investigating opportunities for Vineyard Power to own up to 100 megawatts of the project. So that's that community ownership model that I reviewed earlier. And they're also going to provide reimbursement for operation costs of Vineyard Power up to $100,000. So my main research question for this study was, how do key informants think of a proposed offshore wind farm in the context of community benefits? And then I had these sub-questions for this overarching question of what benefits would best meet the needs of the community and who should administer these benefits. So my study area, the Kitty Hawk Wind Lease, which is located off of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's a 122,405 acre lease area, and it's 24 nautical miles off the coast of North Carolina. And this lease area has estimated generation capacity of around 1,500 megawatts. Avangrid Renewables is the leasee of this area and plans to have an operational wind farm by 2025. And for the purpose of the study, I focused on the barrier island communities in closest proximity to the Kitty Hawk Wind Lease. And these were 6 incorporated towns highlighted in yellow on this map. The main point of operation for the developer is most likely Norfolk, Virginia, which is in the top left corner of this map with a red outline. And this area that I studied is the easternmost county in North Carolina. It has a small year-round population, and it's mostly a tourism-based economy with hospitality, retail, and construction accounting for approximately 40% of local employment. This study was a single case study. This case is unique in that it's the southernmost lease area on the U.S. East Coast. It's also the first offshore wind or first proposed offshore wind farm in North Carolina. So for this study, interviews were conducted with key informants who may be involved with a local policy process for an offshore wind farm. A key informant in this study was defined as an individual who would be able to provide input on potential concerns for the community regarding the Kitty Hawk Wind Lease and identify local problems that may be addressed through community benefits. My focus was on individuals who met the criteria of occupying a position of responsibility and influence with a formal role in the community. Key informants were recruited through purposive and snowball sampling. Purposive sampling, I wanted to focus on local municipalities and key industries on the Outer Banks. So my effort was focused on trying to interview members of the various town governments, county government, and local industries like tourism and commercial fishing. For snowball sampling, participants in the study were asked to recommend other individuals to interview, and their contact information was provided if possible. I should also note that although interview numbers were low with 11 key informant interviews, these same the participants in the study consistently suggested the same individuals to reach out to, and the majority of these contacts were incorporated into the study. All interviews were conducted in person using a semi-structured format with open-ended questions. I asked participants about their role in the community, their perceptions of offshore wind energy and the Kitty Hawk lease, and their thoughts on the provision of community benefits. Interviews were recorded on a password-protected laptop, transcribed in Microsoft Word, and coded for thematic analysis in NVivo. And my thematic analysis utilized procedures established by Braun and Clark 2006. Codes were developed in NVivo based on interview questions and frequent responses that emerged throughout the interview process. My initial coding followed a theoretical approach. So this was driven by my research questions. My secondary coding followed an inductive approach where responses are not tied to specific questions asked of participants. It should be emphasized that all the data was analyzed at a semantic level. Themes were identified within the explicit or surface meanings of the data. I was not looking for anything beyond what a participant said. So my overarching themes. One of the first questions I asked participants was, what did they consider their community? And the purpose of this question is to address one of the common problems in administering community benefits, which is defining the perceived boundaries of the community in question. This is the challenge because perspectives on community depend largely on a resident's collective sense of belonging and shared purpose. In the study, a majority of key informants viewed their community as expanding beyond traditional political boundaries. So, for example, several key informants referenced northeastern North Carolina, which can be loosely translated into 16 counties. This is what some would consider an all-embracing community perspective, where there's a diverse array of communities in a wide area that may encompass areas not affected by an offshore wind development. And then other key informants reference localities of a smaller scale. So one individual identified the island communities specifically on the Outer Banks, and then another key informant referenced island communities that were the incorporated towns, so not any villages or unincorporated locations, just the 6 delineated town governments. One of the main questions I asked key informants was, how will the proposed wind farm affect nearby coastal communities? And for most key informants, they were uncertain about direct benefits, such as local employment. They acknowledged that the Outer Banks had infrastructure impediments, like a small port with a volatile inlet, that hindered the ability to cater to a large industry like an offshore wind farm. However, there was one individual who was optimistic about local employment because they represented an adjacent county that was in closer proximity to the port of Norfolk. For them, their county has historically catered to people who commute to Norfolk for work. So from their perspective, this was a great employment opportunity. One direct benefit that people were actually interested in was the possibility of electricity discounts to relieve the cost of living for many residents on the island who rely on a seasonal income from tourism. There's much more optimism about indirect benefits. They viewed the proposed wind farm as stimulating the regional economy, and several key informants acknowledged that the city and port of Norfolk does have an economic windfall on the Outer Banks. From the perspective of recreational fishing, several key informants were optimistic for the opportunity to fish around the turbines and viewed the wind farm as a new exciting fishing destination. The Outer Banks is a world famous location for sport fishing, and one of the key informants predicted that the wind farm would be good for some fish habitat and attract charter and recreational fishermen around the turbines. From the tourism perspective, one key informant viewed the offshore wind farm as an opportunity to market the community as a green destination. The wind farm, quote, gives the Outer Banks the great reputation that we are environmentally sound because we are using wind energy. And then lastly, a noteworthy theme that emerged throughout the interview process was that key informants were adamantly opposed to offshore oil development. And this response did not come from any question I asked in the interview protocol. One key informant pointed out that the Kitty Hawk Wind Lease was one of the best alternatives that the Outer Banks had relative to offshore drilling. And another key informant emphasized that, quote, the biggest benefit to us, the Outer Banks, is getting Avangrid up and running to supplant all possible oil well locations. So for impacts, the main concern was the possibility of a cable landing and its effect on the commercial fishing industry. Another concern was possible effects on tourism. One key informant pointed out that tourism is our #1 driver for our economy, and we don't want to disrupt that. And an interesting point made by another key informant was that the possibility of a cable landing disrupting beach nourishment along the shoreline, which is a common practice in on the Outer Banks. In their opinion, the developer was never going to fully understand what they are getting into with the nature of the currents and the shifting sands and just how dynamic this area is. They were concerned that the cable may become exposed, and that they emphasized that they did not want a cable getting hit when they are doing beach nourishment. From the commercial fishing perspective, there was concern from key informants because Dare County has a substantial commercial fishing industry. And it wasn't concerns about the cable landing, like I said earlier, but about this displacement in that lease area. But based on information from two key informants who are actively involved in the commercial fishing industry, these effects may be less substantial than first anticipated. One key informant explained that, quote, "It does not appear that there are a lot of active fisheries in that area, the lease area. It is kind of in the middle where there are fisheries inside of it, closer to shore, and fisheries further offshore, but not particular to that lease area." From their perspective.
Well, could you maybe wind up in a couple of minutes so we've got time
Yes.
for discussion? Great, thanks. Yeah.
From their perspective, the wind farm may have some effect, minuscule, but nowhere near the effect of what is happening in the northeastern United States with offshore wind development. So for community benefit preferences, key informants were presented with basic information on community benefits, similarly to what I have done today. The majority had an interest in a community fund, and they saw community funds as a way to address problems in the community, like dredging the local inlet, building affordable housing, and beach nourishment. And then some also expressed interest in community ownership agreement with Avangrid. So for policy recommendations, for developers considering community benefits, it is likely that community members may view their community as expanding beyond traditional political boundaries. And this is something that developers should acknowledge when distributing benefits at the local level. This was not addressed by any key informant, but I should also mention that there are communities of sea, and I think of Madeline Hall Arbor with her research in the northeastern United States with commercial fishermen, where they have defined their community as locations of certain areas of the ocean, not tied to land-based operations. And that's something that developers should consider as well. In addition, the needs of communities will vary, and it is unlikely that a single form of benefit can be effectively administered as a universal approach. Developers will need to collaborate with communities on a case-by-case basis to formulate benefits that best meet the needs of the community. Also, community benefits should be started off early in the process. Research has shown that early involvement of the public in planning and development can have a positive outcome on acceptance. If we look at the image on the left, it's graphed courtesy of Walker and Divine Right, and they're talking about community ownership of renewable energy or community renewable energy. But the same can be said of community benefits, in that you want an element of a degree of openness and participation in the process, and you also want an element of localness and collectiveness in the outcome. And my policy recommendations for the federal leasing process, I suggest that a policymaker should consider the incorporation of community benefits into a phase of the leasing process where public participation already exists. So I suggest that they start these discussions of community benefits with the community in the leasing phase between the developer and potentially affected communities, but they're not going to be able to actually reach an agreement until they have a construction and operation plan out, so that they know who will be affected and to what degree, so that there can be more sufficient negotiations. But it should still start off early. And we can also do I also recommend that there could be a statutory requirement, and this could be accomplished through an amendment to the Energy Policy Act of 2005. For example, the Danish Renewable Energy Act of 2009 requires wind developments to offer at least 20% ownership to local communities. And we could also do an incentive-based policy. So if you look at the leasing area off of Martha's Vineyard, the developer, Vineyard Wind, also actually got a 10% discount on their bid price because they signed a community benefit agreement with Vineyard Power. Now this was a case-specific incentive for that lease area off of Massachusetts. But BOEM could expand this policy to all offshore wind leasing in the United States.